I'm Michael, and welcome to Beyond the Screenplay. Today we are talking about Arrival, the 2016 film directed by Denis Villeneuve, written by Eric Heiserer, based on the story of your life by Ted Chiang. We're here with the Lessons from the Screenplay team, Trisha Arand.
Hello, everyone.
Brian Bittner.
Hello.
And Alex Calleros.
Hi.
So Arrival is a movie, and so I
Correct. The end.
The end. I went back and I watched the video that I made on Arrival, and it's kind of, in my head, a very pivotal video in the history of Lessons from the Screenplay. Like, I think it's video number 17, which at the time felt like I've been doing this for forever. And there was just something about this video, like I wanted to make it special. And I'd reached out to Eric Heiserer on Facebook randomly, just sent him a message, and he actually responded, and we were very close to getting him to come and be interviewed and be part of the video, but it ended up not happening. But it was a moment where it felt like the channel had kind of grown and matured such that I felt comfortable reaching out to a screenwriter. And so I have warm memories thinking back to Arrival and the video about Arrival. And also watching it, I felt like it's probably one of the better videos, or it's just it's very comprehensive. As I was thinking about all the things I wanted to say about Arrival, I then watched the video and I was like, oh, I kind of said a bunch of these things. Anyway, but it's also interesting how my feelings on Arrival have shifted since the time it came out and what the process of dissecting it kind of left me with. And the short story is amazing, and so there's just so many things to talk about. But I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about Arrival, and what does it mean to you? And Trisha, it was very high on your list, or both.
Yeah,
you guys
it was number 5 for both of us on best films of the decade.
Yeah. So
Yes.
so talk about Arrival.
I mean, it's when we talked about our top 10 films of the decade, we didn't go into detail about 10 through 4, but we did go into detail about 1 through 3, and Her was one of mine. And I think, Michael, you were saying it's such an Alex movie. It's got all the Alex things in it. And I think
Not with that tone.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was. No, I don't know why it came out that way.
But such an Alex.
It's so Alex. But I think Arrival similarly strikes a lot of Alex chords, I guess,
Sure.
In the sense that it's a grounded sci-fi movie that tries to actually really go deep with a what if. What if 12 alien crafts landed on Earth? What actually would be the reaction of the global community? How would this actually play out? How complicated would it actually be to try to communicate with completely different species? It really embraces the complexity of all of that and goes to all those places. And then on top of that, it's basically a time travel movie, which I love. And I love, playing with the causality of time and, if something happened in the future or the past, but it affects the present, and what came first. Nothing came first. It's all happening at once. I love movies that screw with your mind that way. And this one did it in a really interesting way. It wasn't your usual time travel conceit. It was this using language as the mechanism for time travel. It was a very just original idea. And then on top of that, just the filmmaker, Denis Villeneuve. I love his style. I love the way he shoots his films. I love his choice of composer. I love, it was both Johan Johansson's music as the main score, and I'm so sad he's gone. It's like a tragedy because he's such an amazing composer. But then
Richter.
The movie's book ended with this Max Richter music, which is, it was funny. I was at Sundance, and there was a live Max Richter performance there of his composition called Sleep. And the Sundance programmer that introduced him said that track on The Nature of Daylight, that's at the beginning and end of Arrival, is the most used piece of temp music in submissions to Sundance.
Wow.
Everybody uses it because it's just it's almost like a cheat code. That there's something about that track that is so moving.
It is.
And Max Richter is one of my favorite composers right now in the industry. So just, it had everything I want from a movie in it. So of course I loved it.
Yeah. I recently rewatched it with my parents, actually, who had never seen it. And, I'd put it at number 5 because I was like, I'd seen it twice the year that it came out, which was in 2016. And I just remembered being so moved by it. And then when I watched it a couple days ago with my parents, every minute that I was sitting in it, I was like, I love this movie. Again, it's a lot of that stuff that really speaks to me. Obviously, language and linguistics are something that completely turned me on, and I'm just so fascinated by. And like what she says about language is the foundation of civilization, and it's the first weapon drawn in a conflict. And I was just like, yes. and
It's a smart movie, and it
Ew,
doesn't
it's so
it doesn't dumb
smart.
it down. Yeah.
It's exactly that. It's a very, very intelligent movie with a very intelligent woman at the center of it. And in no way does it ever pander to her. Like, no one around her is pandering to her.
Sure.
And at the same time, it's kind of a little bit of that effect where, I don't know, I was thinking about it when I was watching it this time. We can get into it more, but like thinking about when we were discussing Silence of the Lambs and how Clarice is like the only woman in the room, you know, most of the time. And
that's a big part of the movie.
It's a huge part of the movie, but it allows her to be vulnerable in a way that like men and women alike, you connect to her. Like when the camera is pointed at her face, and the same with Amy Adams in this film, and she's tremendous in it. But when the camera is right there close and pointed at her face, and she's so vulnerable that first time that she goes up into the craft and she's like breathing heavily, and you can tell that she's really scared, and you can tell that what's happening is totally crazy, and you know, she's so overmatched, and yet she goes and does it anyway. And like every choice that she makes, every second to stay in it and try and really reach out, and she makes all these incredibly brave choices, and yet she's scared at every moment. It's a really, really beautiful character study while being this tense sci-fi, like really tautly directed and gorgeously filmed movie. And I love everything about it. I mean, for me, it's not 100% perfect, but it's really close. It's a great film. Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah. Brian?
I mean, look, it's no The Arrival from 1996 with Charlie Sheen, son of President Bartlett, and Richard Schiff and Terry Polo from The West Wing. I mean, it's basically like a West Wing
I think
prequel.
you're the only person that knows that movie exists.
You guys are younger than me. No, I love this movie. I think it's great. It's funny because Arrival and Annihilation have very similar premises, but they're extremely like very different movies, obviously. But they both sort of like thinking about top 10 films of the decade. Like they both were kind of like, no, they both kind of didn't quite do everything for it. I think Arrival is a better movie. Like, don't get me wrong. But Arrival sort of is like so good at all the technical aspects and being very like well made, and then Annihilation's very good at being like moody and dirty and like all that kind of side, but they both kind of don't do the other thing enough for me in a weird way. So like Arrival doesn't hit me on an emotional level the way that I want it to, but I also think it's, and obviously it does for you, like Trish and Alex look at each other.
The beginning and ending?
I think it's great.
Sorry about your soul, Brian.
Yeah, I think it's great.
Her daughter?
I think the movie is great. It just like, and watching it a second time, I appreciated it more. And I do love the movie. It's just one of those movies that sort of, I think Denis Villeneuve in general as a filmmaker, I'm like, everything you're doing is great, and I love it, and I want more of it, and I'm excited for Dune, and yes. But then there's sort of this element to it that feels a little cold to me, and it doesn't quite hit me in the way that I want to.
It's the Fincher effect.
It is a little
he shares a lot with Fincher.
Latter Day Fincher, yeah, exactly. But that's like literally the only negative thing I have to say about Arrival, because I'm here to talk about this movie, which I think is great.
I feel like my journey has kind of been from the Alex Trisha side to the Brian side a little bit. And I think crafting the video on Arrival, it kind of had this effect that it always happens for me, is like I love a movie, and so it's like I want to get in there and like figure out how it works, and then you take it apart and you kind of figure out how it works, and it's not as special anymore. And I feel like Arrival is like the final product is kind of a miracle of just like all the work that went into like make it arrive at its final product. Like once you kind of understand all of that, for me anyway, it's impossible to just watch it as a movie anymore. So I remember sitting in the theater watching it, and I think it's very much of the time it came out, like the power, like
it was right after the 2016 election.
Days after the election that we saw it.
So like thinking about, world events and countries not talking to each other, maybe.
Right. It was powerful for many of those reasons. Yeah. And so I think the film is great, but I think learning about how difficult it was to make, and then going and reading the short story, like I fell in love with the short story. And I think now the short story works for me better than the movie because there's just something so elegant and simple about the short story, and they're very different in a lot of ways. But for me, the short story is kind of, after reading that and then going and watching the movie, I'm like, the movie doesn't do these things that the short story does, that's just more up my alley. But so I think there's a ton of things to talk about short story wise and construction of the film wise, and there's so much to unpack with this movie. One of the things I want to talk about is the editor, and in the special features, there's a really cool piece on the editing of Arrival, and it's interviewing the editor. And very rarely do special features ever talk to the editors, and it's such an important part of the process.
The third rewrite.
It gets at this thing that I really like to think about, which is that film is a language, and I think that's one of the cool like meta aspects that resonates with the story of the film. Is like, the film is about language, but like film is language also. And the editor talks about how time is kind of the weapon of the editor. And like, as an editor, you're wielding time and you can make a moment stretch out to be really long or get through things faster. And there's just so much editing that needed to happen and is going on to make the story work that it's amazing what they were able to arrive at.
I said I just showed this to my parents, and once you know the central twist or quote unquote twist at the middle of this, where like what you've seen is not a flashback, it hasn't happened yet, right? That like sort of opening up style of prologue.
A twist. Like that was like deep cinema satisfaction for me.
Yes.
Cinema G-spot, you might say.
Yeah.
When I realized that was happening.
It was interesting watching it with people who had never seen it before, because I was like, are they going to figure it out? Because once you know it, you can't unsee it. And it starts to become like obvious in that way that twists do. And so I was just like, and my dad, it was interesting to hear him. He was like verbally processing as stuff was being shown. And so when she started to see flashes of her daughter, which really start to happen right about at the midpoint, right? Which is what you're talking about. It's a very clever editing technique and writing technique to not bring that in, because that's happening throughout the short story, but they really save it in the movie to not start those flashes back to the daughter don't really happen until the midpoint. But once those started happening, my dad was going like, oh, so her daughter actually saw the future. So like, this is like a situation where the daughter's like whole life, this is kind of like Signs, right? Where it's like the daughter's, the daughter like was foreshadowing all of this. So I'm hearing him trying to like figure out the twist.
Yeah. He's like, swing, Meryl, swing.
No, exactly. He was doing that thing where he knew that what he was being shown was significant and was in some way telling the story. But I was just thinking, he never did figure it out until it was really revealed much later. And I was just thinking about the power, the simple power of putting something before something else in a movie.
Right.
Like, you just showed it to us beforehand.
Right.
And for whatever reason, our brains locked it in, even though we've seen flashbacks and flash forwards and we've seen so many of it, like cross-cutting, we've seen it. It's in film language. And yet the very act of when you put it first, we assume it came first, and nothing will talk us out of it.
Well, it's not just
until we have to be talked out of it.
It's not just putting it first. It's the sort of interstitial sort of element that we associate with flashback, which is if you're watching a character for 15 minutes and then you see a 30-second sequence, you assume that's a flashback. You don't assume it's something that's going to happen later.
Yes.
Why would you? And it's using the medium of film and what we understand about film to its advantage.
Which is, I love it whenever movies can do that.
Yeah.
You thought it was the Up prologue, but actually it wasn't. Like,
Yeah. Well, and it's
the Up
so,
epilogue. Ooh.
it just to like underscore what you were saying, Brian, that it's the medium is putting us in the headspace of the protagonist, where we are remembering the future because we saw it first.
Yes.
Right. So we are remembering it the way that she is remembering it, which I feel like is one of the
which
triumphs of this
is like
movie.
a miracle. Like, how do you simulate this impossible thing that she's experiencing? But with the ordering in the edit, they do manage to simulate the experience.
And it also helps that she figures it out at the same time we figure it out. The non-zero sum game moment
Right.
is when she starts going, wait a minute, what's going on here? And that's when we go, wait a minute, what's going on?
Well, I mean, that was one that gave me chills in the theater.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, this movie is not just an alien movie, it's a time travel movie. Yes.
Yes.
It's funny because the other time that's been done that I've seen recently is in Watchmen.
Yes.
Which I read the graphic novel Watchmen before the show came out, and Dr. Manhattan experiences all time at once.
Oh, right.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
he will basically say, like, it's 1984 and I am here, but also it's 10 minutes from now and you're leaving the room crying. And his partner will say, like, what are you talking about? I'm not going to do that. And then 10 minutes later, she leaves the room crying. And you're like, oh, okay. He sees everything at once. And the difference is he sort of experiences everything at once. And he just goes with it. He doesn't really make decisions for the most part. Sometimes he does, but for the most part, he's just like, welp, this is it. Whereas Arrival, obviously, it's giving her the tool of seeing time all at once in order to be able to utilize it to make a choice.
Like
And-
utilize
right,
it.
exactly.
And that's one of the biggest changes from the short story to the movie. And I think that's why in the video, I felt like this was a good set of works to look at as far as like how do you adapt something from, a book to a movie, because like movies are about choice, like characters
They have to be.
have to make choices. And that's one of the things Eric Kaiser talked about was, and the short story is very much about determinism and that there is no free will, and you kind of just, in that Louise, is that even her name in
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
It is, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That she kind of gains this knowledge, and they talk about like the Book of Ages where like suddenly she's able to know everything, but you can't change anything.
Right. Her analogy is she's performing her lines in a play, essentially, where she's like, I know this script. No one else around me knows it, but I'm going to do my lines and they're going to do their lines. And in a way, like, in the short story, she sort of concludes that is freedom? Question mark?
Well, the idea of the Book of Ages is that it's a logical fallacy.
Right. Of
It's,
course it is.
if
yeah.
you can see everything that's going to happen, then you can make a decision that's not going to happen. But if you can make that decision, then you can't see everything that's going to happen. So it just doesn't
Right,
work.
yeah.
And so that was one of the things Eric Kaiser took to Ted Chiang when he was saying, like, these are the things I want to try to change and figure out for the movie. Is I think it's more powerful if in this world Louise does have free will and chooses to have her child despite knowing what's going to happen
Mhm.
to her.
That's the whole ending of the movie, is that choice.
Right.
That's the last line of the movie.
Right. And so it's, again, I feel like that underscores the difference between what you can do in a book and what you can do in a conventional movie anyways. Like the character has to make that choice, and kind of the ripple effect of that change was also, in the book, the child dies at 25 in a rock climbing accident.
Mhm.
But if there's free will, he was like, well, there can't be a rock climbing accident, because she would just call her the day before and be
Yeah.
like,
Ban her from
Don't go rock
right,
climbing.
don't go rock
Yeah.
climbing tomorrow. And so that's why it's sort of changed to this incurable disease,
Right.
where it's just inevitable that she will die. And also they had to change the age of the child because
Mhm.
film is a visual medium.
Mhm.
And so if it was 25 years in the future, Amy Adams would look much more different. So they had to make the child younger so it's believable.
You couldn't fake us out with
Right.
the future
You
past
couldn't
stuff.
trick
Yeah.
the audience in that
Yeah,
same way.
I mean, the video that you did on Arrival is so like good and all encompassing that every time I've thought about, oh, this movie's great because of how it adapted this, story, I'm like, yeah, but the Arrival video already exists. So the only time I got around it was Minority Report, where it was like, oh, there was an original short story, and then there was another script, and then there was the final script, and they all kind of had different takes on everything.
Hey guys, I want to quickly tell you about a film I recently saw on Mubi called VHS Massacre: Cult Films and the Decline of Physical Media. It's a documentary that examines the relationship between filmmaking and the mediums through which we experience film. It tracks the rise and fall of physical media, from Betamax and VHS all the way through Blu-rays and the emergence of streaming services, exploring how each change of medium also changed the kind of movies that got made. The documentary is full of nostalgia for anyone who remembers walking through the aisles of a Blockbuster video, but also highlights the new kinds of opportunities for filmmakers that have come with the popularization of streaming. It's only fitting that this documentary can be seen on Mubi, which is a different kind of streaming service and the sponsor of this episode of Beyond the Screenplay. Mubi is a curated service showing exceptional, hand-picked films from around the globe. It's a great place to discover films that you might not find by searching on your own or by relying on an algorithm. And you can try Mubi for free for 30 days at mubi.com/beyond the screenplay. That's mubi.com/beyond the screenplay. In doing so, you'll be helping to support this show and getting 30 days of exceptional cinema. So whether you want to check out the film I mentioned or discover some of their other gems for yourself, you can do it all today at mubi.com/beyond the screenplay. Thanks to Mubi for sponsoring Beyond the Screenplay.
It's interesting anytime someone has to say, how can I take this and adapt it into something else? One thing I always think of with adaptation is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which the book is told from Chief Bromden's point of view.
Exactly.
And Chief Bromden is crazy. So the book is crazy. It's like, he's like, oh, then I went down to the basement and all the machines were there, like, who make the world work and like all this kind of stuff.
Yep.
And then Milos Forman and whoever actually wrote, I don't know who actually wrote the movie, they took the story, the surface story of the book, and they turned that into a movie. And it's one of the only 3 movies ever to win like the big 5 Oscars. You know, it's a good damn movie, but it's not an adaptation of the book. It's an adaptation of the story the book is telling while it's also doing this whole other thing. And Arrival is a really good example of something that is adapting the sort of heart and soul of the story.
Right, because the story itself, I mean, it doesn't actually get into a lot of the more socio-political implications of, you know, the larger world around
Right.
the story. I mean, at least I didn't get as much richness.
It's a much more internal story.
It's an internally, and it's kind of written almost like to her daughter, and there's a difference in the way it's told, and I think what I love about the film adaptation is that it takes there's almost like a dry math complexity to the dialogue.
I'm going to object to the word dry, but we can get into that. Continue.
I mean, I found it sometimes difficult, to be honest. Like I found some of the long paragraphs of like getting into just like basically like we're reading a textbook right now about this subject.
The refraction of light through water.
It's interesting stuff, but like I had to change my expectations of what I was like reading. Like I had to go from like I'm reading drama to like this is like a heady exploration of things for periods of time, and then we kind of return to like an emotional core. So, which is fine. I like that too. But I think what I'm impressed by in the movie is that he retained some of the heady intellectual ideas just enough, you know, just the right amount to kind of give us the depth of the story, but it was more grounded in the emotional journey for me.
I completely agree. And I think another thing that really makes that work for me. So I've done a couple of pieces that are sort of like related to this, actually. Like I've written a few things myself that are sort of in the same world as Arrival a little bit. I wrote one short film about astrophysicists at the South Pole, female astrophysicists at the South Pole, like wintering over. And there's a lot of talk about like very complex astrophysics. I also wrote a short film about a young woman who has experienced dreams her whole life, and essentially they start coming true, and then they like lead her to meet the person she's going to marry, but then they also like lead the two of them where she ends up like basically being able to rescue them out of a situation because she knows what's going to happen, kind of thing. And with both of those films, it's really hard to strike that balance between like some of these dreamlike, emotional, sort of Maliki kind of poetic things versus like these very scientific concepts. And we see movies like Interstellar try to do this, right? Where it's like, where's the human story buried in the science?
Right.
And how do you carry both of those things on these two sides of the scale? I think that Arrival does it spectacularly.
Right. I think it's one of the better examples of like there's super intellectual conversations that don't feel like incongruous with the deep emotional aspects of the film.
Yeah.
They merge really well.
And honestly, I think a big part of the reason for me why that works is because the language of basically Amy Adams' character, Louise, she is a linguist, but she says relatively little in this story. Like she actually, mostly when we see her, she's sitting and working silently, and we see what she's working on, and we see like her commitment to what she's working on. But actually, it's not like, you know, when she has to explain things to Weber, she does. But most of the time, she is just sitting and we're kind of with her psychological state. But we understand that the science is going on. So, like, we don't need all of the science of how those coffee ring logograms work. You know, we are kind of picking up, and it's the design of them is amazing and cool, and
Yeah.
you know, they obviously
great
they
production
really
design all
they
around.
really wrote
Yeah.
a whole language for this movie, which is super cool. But we don't have to have, it's not that like exposition heavy, science heavy kind of stuff that I think would weigh down the emotional story. We really are just staying focused with Louise and seeing her kind of working silently and working through things.
Yeah.
Really quickly, you mentioned the working silently, and I think watching the movie again, it really struck me how introverted the character is.
Yeah,
and you don't
very
really
much.
you don't see protagonists often in films, especially like female protagonists who are really introverted
Right.
and in an honest to life way. And I think at first, when I first saw this film, I was like, this is like almost too understated a performance, or there's a lot of quiet. But now I kind of really appreciate it, because I'm like, no, there's people that they prefer to be quiet.
Mhm.
They prefer not to talk, and they prefer to just focus. And it's just really cool to see a protagonist that is authentically like embodying that type of
Kind of
person.
personality,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's also partially that Amy Adams never looks like she's acting.
Yeah,
Like, she's
I mean,
just like
she's tremendous.
She's so natural that you're
Right.
just like, I'm just watching a person. This is strange.
Yeah.
I want to return to the short story really quick.
Mhm.
And I don't want to set this up as a competition between which is better, the short film or the short story or the film.
Then don't.
I'm saying it so I am not. But I feel like the things, I just want to kind of explain my experience of reading this short story. And so as someone that is a science nerd and loves physics, like I feel like if film hadn't worked out, like I probably would have like, let's go into like physics and math and stuff. Like I find that fascinating, and there's beauty in that to
Sure.
me. And I feel like that's what's so unique about this short story. Like, you know, for recreation, for a long time, I would watch science videos on YouTube. Like I find that really fascinating. And I've never encountered a story that is so meticulous in the explanation of science, and like the beauty and the fascinating like mind-blowingness of what our reality is, and matched that as equally with this emotional like parent-child relationship. Like it's doing the human emotion stuff as hard as it's doing the science. And for someone that presses all the buttons for, like, that is like miraculous. So like I read this short story and I was like, oh, this is like a masterpiece. And like I understand why Eric Heiser was so obsessed with it. It's doing all these things all at once. And I think the thing that then changed for me is that now when I watch Arrival, and this isn't a knock against Arrival, but now I see the things that can't be on screen
Mhm.
because of
It's a different medium.
Yeah.
the I don't even want to say limitations, but yeah, the differences in the medium. And so now that's kind of my experience, where it's like we see her quietly doing sciencey things, but in the book it's
She's
like
explaining every
it's
single bit of
explaining
it. Yeah.
everything.
Like
And
super in depth about like
Right.
this terminology and
And
what
like
it means. And,
by the end when they were explaining just how the speech works and like all the stuff, I feel like I'm arriving at the place where she's at. We're like, oh yeah, no, like the way we see the world is completely wrong, and like you could just perceive time in this way. And I feel like that I get to nerd out about that in the
Right.
short story, and which you get a taste of in the film. Like it is there, but it's different.
Yeah, and I think the one thing the film does, that both of them do really well, is you have these two central characters, one of whom is a linguist and one of whom is a scientist. So you have these opposing ideas. So already you have these opposing ways of looking at a concept. And then I love the moment where she erases his science to write words on the dry erase board, where I'm just like, and in the book it's actually opposite.
It's the opposite
which is
in the book,
interesting. Right.
yeah.
But in the, he has all these equations written, and she's like, nah, let me erase this just to like put some words on here. And I think that's really cool. So I just think it's interesting because just those two characters, who aren't really in conflict, but their ideals are in conflict in the way that they are sort of thinking about different ways to approach the idea that they are trying to solve.
Well, because there's almost like a status in sciences, I feel like, where like
I mean, that's
physics-
definitely true.
Right. And so I like that both the movie and the story kind of like poke at that and are like, well, maybe actually like this other mode of thinking is the more important one if you're dealing with an alien race that's completely different, which is also something I love about both of these things. It feels like an alien race. Like it's not humanish at all. It's true alien, which I really love.
The design of the heptapods in the movie is really cool. Like
the sound design.
The sound design is amazing. You pointed this out in the video, Michael, but in the short story, they're basically like looking at a screen, right, where the aliens haven't actually landed.
They're Skyping.
They're Skyping. And then in Eric Heiser's words. Yeah. And then imagine, like, think about that shot where you're coming up, where you're in the helicopter and you're coming and the mist is coming over the mountains and then the huge shell is standing up vertically. It's so cool. I remember seeing that in the theater and just being like, this is a new kind of alien movie. It's an alien movie that thinks of itself not really as an alien movie, right? Like,
well, I mean, I think there's a whole sequence in that part of the movie that almost pushes the limits of moving too slowly, where
the entire like first 40 minutes
very meditative.
It's like Denis Villeneuve is like, I'm French Canadian. I'm gonna make a European art film for a little bit here, okay? Like we're gonna like real time go into this ship and like really literally real time. It takes like, it feels like it takes like 20 minutes for him to get like from the camp into the ship.
I love the pacing. I think it works so well.
But I love that he went for it. And it's a studio movie and he did it.
Yeah. I think the way that he earned it.
It's not a studio movie.
Oh.
But yeah.
Oh, it was distributed by Paramount.
It was distributed by studios, but it was double funded by two independent companies because he took it to studios once and they were like, this idea is awesome, it's never going to be a movie. And then he like wrote a script and they were like, the script is amazing, it's never going to be a movie. Like science, intellectualism, female lead, sorry man. And so he had to get it like privately funded by these two other companies, and then the studios
and then they made all their money back and it was a great movie.
Yep.
They made a ton of money.
Yes.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Sorry, what were you saying, Brian?
I think the way it earns the pacing to be able to take a lot of time is how quickly it gets into the plot at the forefront of the movie.
Yeah.
So it's not, here's people and their everyday thing, and then like, oh, aliens showed up. It's just like, hey, aliens showed up. You're a linguist. We need your help. I'm not going to go, yeah, you are. Okay, let's go. And then it's like, so like five minutes into the movie, maybe 8 minutes or something like that, like you're off to the races. Yeah. And then it earns him the time to sort of say, okay, now what does it actually feel like to experience this thing that you've never experienced before?
Right. And he really goes for the experiential approach in the sound design throughout. Like when the helicopters come and land at her house, they're so loud. And he really just puts you in the spaces of the movie. And I really appreciate that from any filmmaker.
Well, you're with her.
Like
there is absolutely no scene in this movie except for I think maybe there's like one or two with the like soldiers when they're like watching the news, whatever, and then they're deciding to do their bomb or whatever they're deciding to do. But like basically you're with her the whole time. And again, that goes back into like, I don't know. I have this joke that like sometimes the best thing you can do as a filmmaker is just get a beautiful woman and a beautiful and interesting woman and put the camera like 6 inches from her face. And honestly, we'll maybe watch her do anything for 2 hours. Truly.
Right.
Like, and this movie sort of keeps you with her in that way. And so, and it goes back to all the sound design, all the silence. She is an introverted person, but because she knows so little and she doesn't ask, like that's the other thing. She is being taken to this place, like they're telling her like, we're going to give you this shot and we're going to zip you into this suit. She doesn't ask anything. She doesn't have any questions because she knows all of this will be revealed, right? And in the same way that we as an audience member sit and we don't ask. Maybe in our heads we do, but we try to just wait. And that creates that tension of waiting where we know a movie is going to reveal itself to us in the time. And when you're in the hands of a master filmmaker, you trust that even more. And you're just like, this is going to show itself to me. I'm going to have the answers that I want. I can't wait to find out what they are. And in the meantime, I can't do anything but ride along. She feels like she's doing that as well. And part of that is the character design. It's really, really great.
And that sort of piggybacks off of what I was just talking about, which is it's a little bit talking to the audience and saying like, look, we've seen Alien Arrival movies before.
Yeah.
Like, so we don't need to spend that time. You're like, what do you mean there's alien? It's like, no, they're here. Let's go. Like, yeah.
Well, I actually like the stoicism on like her face and the students' faces when they turn on the TV.
Oh, yeah.
That moment.
That seems like an interesting choice because instead of like
Screaming in hysteria.
freaking out, it's like everybody's brains just froze. Like this isn't possible, so my brain has just turned off, and I'm just like in a stasis watching this.
It's a collective, huh?
Yeah,
A bit more than that.
Yeah.
I feel like that moment is really significant and signaling tonally like this
Yes.
is what this movie
Right. This is not a
is.
normal like freak out alien movie.
right. This is the like, you know, 9/11 is happening and like no one knows what to do about it, but like can you turn on the TV? So like
Yeah.
it's a very real reaction of just like fear and doing kind of like what you know you have to do to get to the next part of existing in this moment.
Well, then when she's leaving the school and like people
Right.
are bumping into her with their cars and like there's
Right.
planes flying overhead and like generally it seems like things are happening and it's panicking and
But that's the most it gets. You're not cutting to the freeway where everyone is like trying to leave
like you
town.
see it on the news, but it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's very much what Denis Villeneuve brought to it. And I think that's again why it's such an interesting study of like film and how film gets made, because you know, watching it again, kind of knowing where she ends up and her relationship with them, with the aliens, like the aliens are like cool, like they're like BFFs by the end, it feels like. And so it's in one way it's been weird for me watching again, being like you spend 40 minutes, like the beginning of the movie is almost like horror, like there's so much tension.
it's the unknown.
Yeah.
So yeah, once you know where it goes, it loses some of its power. But on that first viewing,
Right.
you don't know what's going to happen.
And I feel like that's again why this movie is like it's almost like cheating is how it feels, where it's like this almost like shouldn't work. Like on paper I know that this makes sense or is the right call, but like obviously it was the freaking right call because it's amazing. And that always like messes with my brain. But yeah, so much tension is built into the reveal of the aliens that like by the end of that sequence you're just completely with her.
So this movie was made for less than $50 million. And so I'm sure some of those choices were budgetary, right? Like where if you had a studio involved, they probably would have wanted to be like, well, and then we cut to like the huge like thing and
the protests in DC.
Yeah, and like there's mass chaos and then we cut to the president and then there's a thing, you know, it's just like, you know, it becomes something more like Independence Day. Right, yeah. or even I was thinking about something like Deep Impact, which is like a little bit of a smaller human story, but kind of the same apocalyptic
Whatever. With a Quiet Place where they were like, we don't want to cut to the
right.
president.
We
like,
don't want to cut to those things. And so by turning down, well, studios turned down them, but like, again, these sort of like lower budget sci-fi things, it enables you to be or forces you to be a little more creative in a way that ultimately ends up serving the material a lot better. And so I'm really glad that like we have to stay with her. There's a lot of stuff she doesn't know because she doesn't experience it directly. You have those shots where she's sitting in the most beautiful lake house ever.
Right. Yeah. This time I was also like, did you make enough money to live in this place?
They pay those professors well at that university.
Yes. I mean, who knows where she is, but maybe, you know, it's a really beautiful home. But she's sitting there and she's watching the news broadcasts, and that's kind of as close as you get. And it feels like that, again, is the human experience of what a disaster feels like.
Right.
Like, that's all of us watching our TVs on 9/11. Like, we know that there were people screaming and dying in the streets, but most of us weren't there. Most of us were sitting on our couches at home watching our televisions. And so keeping us with her, and again, keeping that sort of centered and focused, whether it's for budgetary reasons or not, is sometimes a really smart choice, especially in this kind of film.
I think this movie, better than most, used like the news broadcast as a storytelling tool.
Yes.
Because a lot of other movies
doesn't feel contrived.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and like even the casting and the way just the performance of the news people seem better than average. Like I can't tell you how many like big studio movies I see and they cut to like a news report and it just feels really cheap and bad and weird.
There's also an interesting thing. This is like totally separate, but it's a little related, which is I do like when a movie does either a sports broadcast or a news broadcast and they actually use like the cameras and the graphics that like
Yeah.
you would
Yeah.
have, because a lot of times it's like, oh, I'm clearly watching an actor do a news broadcast because it doesn't even look like a news broadcast.
It looks like it was shot on the Alexa and like, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to know what you think about the third act of this. So, like, at the midpoint of the film, we start to really get hints that something else is going on with the daughter. These flashbacks, as we perceive them at the time,
Mhm.
are becoming more and more significant to her. They're breaking into her consciousness. They're really disturbing her. And then as the third act begins and it sort of starts to become clear what's actually going on, I want to know what you think about the way it unravels and how the reveals are ordered. What do you think?
I think it works really well, especially on first viewing. I think this is kind of one of the problems as I've gone, when I read the original screenplay and kind of listened to them talk about the editing process. Like, I feel like now I can feel we're at this point in the movie, and kind of like you were saying, Louise doesn't say a lot and doesn't do a lot. Like, there aren't a whole lot of like choices for her to make that like have repercussions. So it's a lot of external pressures that have to happen. And so I kind of feel that now when the third act comes and it's like, well, we've introduced China is bad, and like now they're going to be super bad, and so now there's more of a ticking clock kind of thing. So I feel like it's one of those things where it probably isn't following all the rules and what's supposed to happen, but the world is affecting her and affecting the story such that we're still feeling the emotional beats when we're supposed to feel them. And so it works. And that's, again, in listening to them talk about the editing process, I think Denis Villeneuve said it was the hardest and the longest editing process he'd ever been on, because, if you're dealing with time and like there's so
when to
many,
reveal what
when
to
to reveal
yeah.
what, and like how to reveal. And so especially the montage that happens around the midpoint where Jeremy Renner's like, let me tell you about like what's going on. Like,
Hey guys, I'm in this movie too.
Right. Oh yeah,
Which
Jeremy.
I really love that montage, by the way.
it works super well.
It does work.
Yeah. But it came about because there was like 3 or 4 other scenes that just like,
Yeah.
like we need this piece of information from that one and that one.
Yeah.
And so we're just going to make a montage out of it. Okay. And it works. It's just like, here's 2 minutes. We're going to tell you all this. This is what you need to know for the movie to move on. Now the movie can move on.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, it
It's
works.
got a great piece of music.
Well,
It does.
as far as like the third act goes, were you trying to kind of get at something in particular, Trisha? Because I think it's a great third act.
I agree. I think that the way the denouement comes together, I don't know. I'm wondering, for me, it's just like once we get to the reveal of, well, okay, then she has seen the future. So it's like after she goes back up into the ship, right? And then the heptapods give her the gift of like seeing all time.
Mhm.
Then it sort of starts to become, well, okay, what do you do with it? And that part of the plot that has to then happen,
Right.
I'm curious because that's where I start to bump on the movie. Where I'm
Well,
like,
she conveniently flashes to the
Gala,
gala
yeah.
where she's.
It does
yeah.
feel like, and now she has to save
and now
the
there's
world.
a plot. Yeah.
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 And that is not in the short story.
Right.
Because the short story does kind of just peter out a little at the end, where you're like, wait, well, then what happened? And maybe it's because I've seen the movie, but it's a little bit like, and
Yeah.
then what?
It's the short story is very much about like her and her experience, and like kind of everything else about like aliens are invading like is in the background.
Right.
Like doesn't
Right.
matter
The
at
bigger
all.
world story is
Yeah.
not as important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think because, once again, especially on the first viewing, it is such a revelation to realize that
Mhm.
one, everything she's been seeing is like at a different point in time, seeing, and then the alien then confirms it to her that it is the future. When she asks, like, who is this girl? What is this girl?
Mhm.
Louise sees the future. So we really only just got confirmation that she's seeing the future. I think there's just such a thrill in then going to any point in the future and then having her realize she can take that information back to the present, that, yeah, in some ways I can see how it maybe isn't earned or it's cheating or something to just kind of introduce this new element at that point. But because the twist is so satisfying and because it has been set up, there is, General Chang is a presence throughout the movie. And,
Yeah,
it's
definitely
all
true.
about, it's interesting commentary on the world too, of, all these countries are following China's lead. What's China going to do? So I think, I don't know, for me, I've never bumped on it. It always felt like it was just the next exciting thing to come out of this amazing twist.
I feel like it works because there's just so much emotional momentum in the movie
Yes.
that starts. I think again that tension build up is sort of like the going up the roller coaster. So you have all this like built up stuff, and then I feel like the rest of the movie does a good job of like hitting each emotional beat and like now this thing's happening and this thing, but you didn't see that coming. That's crazy. And like there is this building up of energy that I think takes you all the way through the end and delivers a very satisfying emotional conclusion. So it kind of overrides plot stuff, and the plot is really just there to kind of serve that emotional ride, and I think it all like works.
And time travel stuff
But-
always kind of is never perfect, you know. It's
That's
hard.
true. That's
It's hard.
absolutely true.
Yeah, the thing that's a question for me is like the first quote unquote flashbacks, but they're actually flash forwards. You see, I don't think we see Louise having a response to them. So I think for me, I start to wonder, when is she actually having these? Like, is every time we see it happening in her head, but then we don't find out until later? Or is that a little bit of film trickery where we're being shown things that she's not starting to see
I
yet?
think she's seen them, but she's just kind of like, what was that? Like
It's
I
a
think
very
they're-
understated reaction.
I think they're
think.
more like, I think maybe they're not as clear as we're seeing them.
Mhm.
You know, I
Mhm.
think maybe in her brain, it's like, what am I
I
daydreaming
feel like there's
about?
also a sound cue, isn't
Yeah.
there, where that she like starts to like
It's like
hear
a, it's like a
For a while
paper.
she like hears
Yeah.
and I feel like again
I'm
that-
talking about like even the opening of the movie. Like,
Sure.
I don't
Well,
think
well, I
that's-
don't. I don't
Oh, yeah.
I don't think the
I agree
opening of
with
the
that.
movie is supposed to be like a present time flash.
Right.
And
I
that's where it
agree.
gets tricky for me because like it's a little bit of the movie
It's cheating.
right, it's cheating in a way that works for the movie, but that also makes me, having watched it the second time now, I'm still kind of going, wait, when is she actually seeing it versus it's just something we're being
Well,
shown?
I feel like the beginning of the movie, we're just being shown like
Right.
that present time of her life.
but
you
then
know?
that
and
does
then-
make it feel like kind of pulling the rug out from you, where it's like, oh, but also she's seeing it, and then also it's the future, and also now she has to save the world. Like it's where it gets a little just like, it's not perfect, even though I think it works really well.
I think it's perfect. I love it.
I think it's a movie where if you try to analyze it and judge it objectively, it can fall apart quickly, but the
Mhm.
emotional construction of it is
Right.
spot on.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think I'm just so impressed with the movie that can both still feel like a whole, like it has a holistic quality to it that has both this like big socio-political story with like all the governments are turning off their monitors, and you know,
right, and that part is
Yeah.
really thematically effective. When,
Yeah.
you know,
like we're
for
not
a-
talking to each other.
for a movie about
Right.
communication,
Right.
right? And that is one of the changes you talked about, Michael, in the video from the short story, which is like the actual gift that the aliens end up giving her in the movie is their language, and their language itself is
what
time.
unifies.
Right,
and- yeah.
exactly. Like
Mhm.
their language has no beginning and end. In order to read or write their language, you have to be able to see all time at once, essentially. And so that, in the book, it's like a lot less clear and like
I completely disagree, but I understand.
But I'm saying the holistic part is that she
Yes.
then uses that language to unify and get the world talking to each other again.
exactly.
And
because
on-
the phone number that he calls and
Yeah,
she
yeah,
calls
yeah.
and
That's fine.
See, this is I'm with you on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's like yeah, you said the words of my dying wife. Yeah, okay, fine. It's a little cheap.
Eric Heiser had an impossible task. Right? I
Agree.
feel like he
Absolutely
did an amazing
agree.
job.
Yeah,
to
I
be
agree
clear.
with that.
But yeah, to give me the cool like big picture socio-political story and then end with the gut punch of like I'm gonna choose to have a baby even though I know it's gonna die.
Yeah.
Like that incredibly personal story, but they're both part of the same story somehow. You know, like most movies can't give me all those levels at once.
Sure.
And so any movie that can do that all at once in like a seamless way, I give it some slack. You know, because it's like,
And I feel
how
like-
do you do both those stories at once and make them hit me in the gut like that?
Yeah.
And then that's kind of exactly what I'm saying about the short story is I feel like it's
Mm.
doing the science part and that gut punch together. And I feel like they're both successful at handling those things. And again, this is a thing I talk about in the video too, but
But less cinematically because it's a different medium.
right. They're
Yeah.
completely different.
I was also pretty sleepy when I was reading it, so maybe I gotta drink some coffee first.
See, like
Yeah.
that like wakes me up. I was in bed last night and I was like, I need to finish this. And then I got to the graph of like the light refraction and like
The graph is cool.
but like that light has to know where it's going
It
in order
does.
to
That
like
was like trippy to me. That
this
was
is what I'm
really
saying. Like,
trippy.
science is insane and it's amazing. Anyway,
Michael is nerding out right now.
Dude, I have so many notes about all these nerdy things that I'm not going to talk about. But if you're a nerd, read the short story also. It's amazing. But I do like, I think, again, what makes the film work emotionally, despite perhaps not being mechanically perfect or whatever, is that, that all the conflict comes externally. I feel like you were saying, Trisha, resonates thematically also.
Mm-hmm.
Like, humans are the ones causing
Yes, we are.
the problem. Like,
Right,
the aliens are
right.
just here to like chill. And
They really are.
like, it's literally that you introduce like neutral aliens to humanity, and
And
we're
we
gonna end the
freak
world.
out.
We are going to.
Yeah.
And I love that, because I love when science fiction does that. And just like, again, and I talk about this in the video, and there was some quote that I wish I could find that I read, that some scientist said that when you study an other, you're also intrinsically studying yourself. And I love that. And I feel like this movie is such a great example of that idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have one last thing I want to mention real quick, which is we talked about how like pretty the movie is and all that kind of stuff. I think the cinematography is exceptional, but also all the centering it does. There's so much symmetry in it. Usually it's Louise at the center of a shot, where it's the kids in the classroom looking, and she's watching the TV, and we're seeing her in the middle, and the kids or her in the lake house looking out. There's so many shots where she's right in the center.
The best shot in it, which is where she is standing right in front of the glass,
Yeah.
and then there's the ring right on the glass, and she
Right.
turns her head in the middle. It's so good.
Right, and I just love that as a reflection of the theme
Yeah.
of the sort of symmetry, being able to see time all at once, being able to form a sentence all at once, and then you have the cinematography that actually reflects that. I think that's really cool.
Shout out to Bradford Young, who was also the first African-American cinematographer to be nominated for an Academy Award. For
Wow.
this movie.
Yay,
Yeah.
Bradford
He
Young.
knocked it out of the park,
Yeah.
man. I love the way this movie looks.
It's tremendous.
Yeah.
All right. Well, why don't we go around and say what lessons we're going to take away from Arrival? Alex?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons I took away is just, I mean, it's kind of a personal lesson, but I'm really impressed with any film that can cut to my like core and make me realize like the fragility of life and the preciousness of life and how it will end and it is fleeting. And, a lot of movies have death in them, but you don't feel much. There's a lot of movies about death and a lot of people die, or, it's very violent or something. But when a movie lets you know that like the people you love are going to die, and we're all making a choice to love them while they're here, like, and it makes you feel that this deeply, I feel like it's a gift. I feel like it's, that's almost like what I want more movies to do, just to the population of like, listen, you're alive and your loved ones are alive, and like, stop being horrible to each other. We're all gonna die, and I think to have that like embedded in like also a really heady sci-fi movie is just so beautiful, and it's kind of what I aspire to with the kind of sci-fi I want to make. So yeah, just props to the team for pulling that off, because it's what I want more movies to be.
Yeah, and the emphasis on communication, right? Which like open lines of communication is how we love each other.
Yes, yeah.
Which to me is like, that's absolutely the thematic thing that I like can't get over about this.
Well,
movie.
and also, and Louise's final choice, I think, is so powerful,
Yeah.
because it's just the idea of like the person you love most is going to die, but you're going to choose to like go through the experience of loving them anyway, knowing the loss that will come. That is the most bittersweet, poignant, thing. And I love when movies do that.
It reminds me of one of my favorite movies of 2019, The Farewell.
So good.
Which is this sort of like, I know you're not going to be around much longer, and I want to spend time with you, but you don't know that that's going to happen to you, and that's
Very
like,
similar, yeah.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
I think the lesson for me goes back to Louise's character design. And I wish we'd gotten to talk about this a little bit more, but she is an introverted character. She says actually very little, and yet her value system and her passions are very clear. Like she doesn't have to say a lot, because the things that she does tell us everything about who Louise is.
Mm-hmm.
And so like thinking about the sequence where she goes, the first time when she goes and she encounters the aliens, and then she, like steps forward away from everybody else and walks forward. And then like in the next sequence where she's like, it is her job, but we understand that this is her passion. And it isn't about a lot of like needless speaking. She doesn't speak ever for any reason unless it's to purely attempt to communicate. Like there are all of these choices that she makes, where she like grabs the whiteboard, which again, what a beautifully like conveyed decision, where she's sitting and zipping herself into her suit and she sees the whiteboard and she's like, doesn't say anything. She just sees it. The next time we see her, she's carrying it. Right. And then same thing with the scene where she takes her suit off before she goes in. She's like fidgeting with the suit, and we can tell how much it bothers her and it doesn't make sense to her and she doesn't like it. Then she looks over, she can hear the canary chirping. All of that is visual. That is what film language is capable of. Like, you have to do it in words in the short story, but you don't have to do it in words in the screenplay and in the movie. And you can absolutely convey who a character is if they are like a truly introverted person with all of these other tools that you have at your disposal as a screenwriter. And the way that Louise is designed is just so brilliant. If you just, and of course, brilliantly acted by Amy Adams from top to bottom. And it's one of the worst snubs in Oscar history. I can't believe she wasn't even nominated.
What?
It just like,
She
she
wasn't?
no.
Ugh.
This movie was nominated for 8 Oscars, but not for Amy Adams, and I think she was nominated for a Golden Globe as well, but
That's bizarre.
It's
pretty weird.
infuriating. But
Also,
yeah.
it's like both Denny and Eric Heiser, like when Eric
Yes.
Heiser was pitching it, he was like, I pitched it with like, it'd be cool to have Amy Adams. Like from
Wow.
from 2011, he was saying that. And then when they had Denis Villeneuve come in, he was like, I'll make it if we can get Amy Adams. Like, first choice from everyone.
And
from
according
the
to
beginning.
the
That's
legend,
awesome.
she said yes within 24 hours of getting the script.
Nice.
So, well, write an interesting character and people will say yes. Like, write a really interesting, compelling character, even if they don't say a lot, because that's the thing. I think we as screenwriters fall into this trap of like, well, if we give this character cool monologues, then they're a
Right.
cool character. You don't need to do that.
Right.
You can actually just design a well-written character that doesn't have to say very much, but still is really clear. And it's so good.
Yeah. Brian.
Mine's, I guess, less of a lesson and more of sort of an observation, which is I listened to the audiobook of this short story, and it's about 2 hours long. The movie is about 2 hours long. And there are things in the short story that don't even get covered. Like, there's more relationship with her daughter and like fun little scenes where you're like, oh, I love this character. I love this relationship. And it makes it more heartbreaking. Meanwhile, there are 2-hour movies that are adaptations of 500-page books. And there's just so much plot shoved together and that kind of thing. And obviously, there are ways to adapt anything into anything if you know what you're doing. But it strikes me, I'm really happy that we are sort of getting to a point where we're realizing that some stories need to be told in a certain amount of time. 2 of my favorite books of all time are American Gods and Good Omens. And I was so happy when they're like, no, we're adapting this into Good Omens was a 6-part miniseries, which covered the whole book. American Gods was currently 2 10-episode seasons that goes off the rails in terms of that being a true adaptation of the book. But it's like, there's so much here. It's like a 550-page book. There's so much here. We're not going to try to make this a 2.5-hour movie. We are going to really explore this territory. So I love when I see something like Arrival or The Shawshank Redemption or even Benjamin Button that's an adaptation of a short story, which is like, look, there's a ton to explore here in this 60-page story. We can actually make a movie out of this rather than trying to take this like massive book and then just trim all the fat, trim all the stuff that is interesting and just like leave it with just the very surface plot level stuff and then turn that into a book. So yeah, again, I don't know if there's really a lesson there as much as more of an observation about what I think tends to work better as an adaptation than other things.
Yeah, I feel like my lesson kind of has to do a little bit with adaptation, but kind of more just film language and looking at Arrival, reading the short story. It kind of gave me these tools that helped reveal what makes each medium itself, I guess. We're like reading the short story, appreciating so much about it, and then seeing the film adaptation of it, which I think is also amazing, but makes very clear, what had to be removed, what had to be changed, reveals the strengths and weaknesses of both mediums. And I think that's just a useful thing to have as a reference point of understanding what a film is and what it can do.
Definitely.
And like how to maximize those things. And I feel like Arrival, like the combination of everyone that worked on it also, like I think just really lays that bare, because I feel like it's in the filmmaking, and I mean that from like the screenwriting all the way to the director, everything that everyone touched it, like made it be what it is. And so it's a very pure example of like when filmmaking is happening, this is what the end result can be. And it's different from books and other mediums, and knowing those differences is key when you're trying to create something.
Yes, very much.
Yeah.
For those of you who haven't read the short story, it does do the same interstitial thing as the film, which is that she's telling the plot of the story, and then every once in a while it's, oh, you're 8 years old and I'm helping you tie your shoes, that kind of thing. So it does the same sort of, it's telling you the story simultaneously in the same way the film does. And that part at least made sense in adaptation. And then there was all the other problems of, oh, it's a visual medium, how do we represent this?
And it kind of reveals it slowly in its own way, where like she's talking about these moments in the daughter's life, and I think at first she's sort of saying, I remember when you were this, but then she starts saying like, I remember when you will do this, and
right.
kind of uses its like tricks of its own medium to kind of start incepting you with like, wait a minute, something's different about these.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. The story tells you the daughter is going to die pretty much right at the beginning.
Right. Yeah. It does. It's on the first page where she's talking about the houses they lived in, and she's like, we bought this house 2 years before you were born and we sold it 2 years after you left, kind of thing.
And there's this one moment that I just wanted that for some reason really resonated with me in the story, where she and the Ian character, who's named Gary in the short story.
Ian, such a better name.
Yeah.
Sorry, all the Garys out there.
Eric Heiser agreed. But they're shopping because he's invited her over for dinner.
Yeah.
And she goes...
The wooden bowl.
Right. There's this bowl, and she sees the bowl, and then she remembers a future memory where the bowl like falls on her daughter's head or something, and it's injured, and it's this... For some reason, just that moment really spoke to me of like these things, these tiny decisions that you make at some point can play huge roles in your life later on. And I feel like when I'm experiencing those moments, when the bowl falls, whatever for me, it feels almost like time travel, because I can remember like where this began, and like now I'm here, and I feel like the story captures that in a really beautiful way. So shout out to the salad bowl.
Yeah, and to Ted Chiang.
Indeed. We didn't get to talk about determinism and free will, but one day we'll get to talk about this on the podcast.
We talked about it a little in Minority Report.
Yeah,
I know, a little bit. I want to argue about it for a long time.
All right.
But for now, why don't we talk about what we've been watching recently? Brian.
Mine's a little different this time. It's a British panel show called Would I Lie to You? Which is one of my favorite panel shows. And if you don't know British panel shows, it's a game show, but
I do.
no one cares about points. It doesn't matter. It's more of like, they call it light entertainment over there. So you have the host, Rob Brydon, and then you have 2 teams of 3 with 2 team captains who are on every episode, David Mitchell and Lee Mack, who are 2 of the funniest people alive.
Okay.
And then on each team, there are 2 guests each time. And someone has to pick up a card that they've never seen before, and it either says something true about them or a lie about them, and they read it out. So they're either saying, I blah, 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 this thing that actually happened to them, or they're saying something that the writers wrote to put on their card. And then the other team questions them for 2 to 3 minutes about what they just said. And then at the end, the other team has to then decide whether they're telling the truth or telling a lie.
Interesting.
So obviously, if you know it's a lie, you want to make it sound really factual, and really you want to put a lot of little detail in there and that kind of thing. And if it's true, then you maybe want to be a little iffy about things, and maybe you don't quite remember something. And it's a really fun show. You can actually watch on YouTube. They put up basically every individual clip, so you can basically watch the entire episode just by watching all the clips together. But the reason I wanted to mention it, other than the fact that the latest season just concluded, is it's really interesting from a storytelling, screenwriting standpoint to think about what makes something believable. First of all, what makes a compelling story that you're actually invested in, but also what are those little tiny things that make you go, no, sometimes they'll be like, oh, he mentioned like, the color of the something, and that suddenly made me go, this must be real, because he's remembering that thing. And sometimes they're just really good liars, and they know that those little details are going to make you question or whatever. So it's actually really fun to watch it from just an entertainment viewpoint, but also an analytical viewpoint.
And anthropological
Right, exactly.
viewpoint as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's almost like dramatic irony, the TV show, but also like humans are so bad at like knowing the truth and telling lies. I don't know. It seems fascinating to watch on like many different levels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm intrigued.
And there's one segment where they bring out a guest, and then each of the three people on a team has to say how they know that guest. So obviously, like only one of them is telling the truth. So then they have to sort of like use like the guest's like gender and age and how they look to like spot to sell what they're actually saying about who they are. And
That's
everything.
fun.
Yeah,
Makes me want to talk about Malcolm Gladwell for forever, but I won't.
I know
right
what
now.
you're gonna say.
Trisha, what have you been watching?
So I recently watched the 1995 Gus Van Sant movie To Die For, starring Nicole Kidman and Matt Dillon. Has anybody seen this?
no, but are you just like looking for movies that are as similar to the new Bond title as possible?
That's her only rubric.
No, because this is Nicole Kidman, Matt Dillon, Joaquin Phoenix, baby Joaquin Phoenix, Casey Affleck, Buck Henry, and Wayne Knight. It's a wild cast.
Wow.
Uh-huh. No, I recently showed Moulin Rouge to a group of high schoolers who had never seen it before and didn't know anything about it, and they loved it.
that
I'm
like?
happy
Okay.
to report they
Okay.
loved it
Good.
a
Cool.
lot.
Good.
They were weeping, they were yelling and laughing, and they were really, really invested.
Interesting.
But this Nicole Kidman movie popped up, and I was like, let's check it out. It's Gus Van Sant, and the screenplay is Buck Henry as well, who I love as a screenwriter. He wrote The Graduate, and a lot of other wonderful scripts. And it's kind of a Gone Girl meets I, Tanya, if you can go with me.
Okay.
But
It's Fast and the Furious.
But Nicole Kidman basically plays like she's the weather girl at like a small town news station kind of thing, and her husband Matt Dillon ends up dead, and so like she looks straight into camera for most of the movie and like is telling her side of the story, and it's intercut with like a bunch of other different scenes and things like this, and Joaquin Phoenix and Casey Affleck play these like teens who are under her influence, and there's this sort of like faux documentary style to it. It's goofy. Like Nicole Kidman is doing a very big impression of like this perky, like her voice is pitched like 2 octaves higher than her normal voice is, and her American accent is dead on. But it is just like sort of she's doing like a bimbo kind of act. It's really interesting. I mean, it's not a perfect movie. It's far from that. It's just sort of like an interesting study on all of these actors, and like sort of a lost piece of filmography that I hadn't heard anybody talk about, and with like some murder mystery kind of perks in it, and it's interesting. No, I really enjoyed it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Alex.
So my film this week is from the platform Mubi, Mubi, and they are a sponsor of this podcast often. They support us, so I love checking out their catalog. It's always changing. But yeah, you get a subscription on their catalog, and they kind of curate a really wide variety of films. Some of them very recent, a lot of foreign films, some like kind of from the archives.
It's always fascinating to see, like, what do you got for me to
Right.
see?
Yeah. No, I feel that
Some
way
are like
too.
shorts also, and
Yeah.
Yeah, documentaries. But I was scrolling through and I saw a familiar face, Mr. Louis Garrel, who you may recognize from
Dreamboat.
Little Women. He is Joe's love interest. Well, I guess it's a spoiler. I don't know. Anyway,
It's at the beginning of the movie.
He's the
he's
foreign
the hot guy in the beginning.
He's the foreign guy with the accent. But yeah, he co-wrote and directed and stars in a movie that is currently streaming on Mubi, called A Faithful Man, and it is like the Frenchiest French film I've ever seen. It was delightful for that reason. It was just so French. It was all about, the French approach to love. It's like everybody's kind of having affairs, but very like stoic about it. And, I don't know. It was a very like charming, weird, kind of, I guess, romantic comedy, but like in a very French way. So
interesting.
if you want to just have a French experience of love,
Wait, what country was this from?
the Frenchiest French thing
Okay.
I've ever seen. Faithful man. Check it out.
Michelle?
Nice.
So I recently finished the last season of BoJack Horseman,
Yeah.
which
Mhm.
like holy hell is just like so good. I feel like I can't talk about it too much without like spoiling it, but we were kind of just talking about this. We recorded a Q&A episode for patrons, and we were talking about how comedy can kind of weaken your armor and lower your defense
Yes.
mechanisms such that emotion seeps its way in a way you wouldn't normally let it. And I feel like BoJack Horseman is such a pure example of that, where just the concept of the show is even so absurd. Like I remember when my girlfriend was trying to convince me to watch it, and I was like, wait, so it's an animated show, it's a guy, he's also a horse, and like what?
He's an actor in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's like on one hand, it's so goofy and absurd. But like right underneath it is some of the most like bitingly honest observations about life and our society and what it means to be a person, and depression and happiness and achievement and just all these things. And it's just, there have been so many times over the seasons where you're like going along and this is like super funny, and then it makes a left turn and suddenly it's like, how do I not cry? How do I not cry right now? And this last season like just nailed it 100% for me, and is some of the most potent emotional like storytelling I feel like I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So I highly recommend BoJack Horseman. It's really, really good. I feel like they ended on an awesome note.
Yeah, it brings it home in the way that you want it to. And
Yeah.
and yeah, the show is just like literally in an interstitial cut, it'll be a giraffe valet getting into a car and he has to like curl his head in order to like fit in the car. And then it cuts to like, oh, addiction and sex, and like I'm really upset about my life, and all this kind of
Right.
like, oh crap, like we're actually going here. And in a way, it makes it so much more effective than just
Yeah.
showing humans in a way that you're expecting to see drama.
Right.
Mhm.
Like almost by allowing itself to do that entire dynamic range, it lets you like have that far of an emotional switch within the same
Mhm.
piece of storytelling. So super, super good. Highly recommend.
Yay.
Yeah. Great. Well, this has been our conversation on Arrival. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to the patrons who support the show. And we will see you all in the next episode.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.